and welcome to the final evening of our Interface Lecture Series. For those of you who have been to the other lectures, it's such a joy to have journeyed with you and to have had these conversations with you. And I'm thrilled tonight that you're here to hear Dr. David Robinson, who has done a lot of work, and has been a leader for us as we prepared these lectures. So welcome. If this is your first time, I know some of you, it's your first time here, just a brief word about who we are at Regent. We're a graduate institute that offers 4 unique programs that intend to integrate rigorous academics and vibrant faith. And because of our unique programs, we attract a diverse community of students, from scientists, as you will note, to artists, from businessmen and medical professionals to biblical studies enthusiasts, from future pastors to former stay-at-home mothers like myself. And it's on behalf of that diverse community that I extend to you a warm welcome tonight. My name's Brianna Russell, and I'm a second-year student here at the college. I'd also like to acknowledge that tonight we're gathered on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. For those of us who are joining not in this space, but in this place of discussion via live stream, welcome to you as well. Last time we had the lecture, we had a wonderful woman write in from Korea, and she said she was overjoyed to be able to partake in these lectures via live stream. So we welcome you from wherever you're watching in the world. A few notes about tonight. The lecture will be about 50 to 60 minutes long, then we'll have a response, and then we'll have a time of questions. At that point, you're welcome to go to the microphones at the back to voice your questions, so be thinking of them throughout the lecture. If you do need to stand and stretch your legs at any point during the evening, I invite you to do so anywhere but in front of the emergency exits at the back, and this is where I harness my inner flight attendant and tell you that the exits are at the back and there's one here at the front should, in the unlikely event of an emergency, we need to use them. Restroom facilities are located across the hall. The men's is towards the front of the building and the women's at the back. The accessible washroom is directly across from the stairs in the center. If you brought some sort of connection to the outside world with you tonight, be it a computer or a cell phone or a tablet, could I please invite you to turn them to silent or off for the duration of the evening? With that, I would like to invite Dr. Ross Hastings, and I have to read this because my pronunciation is not what it should be, the Sang Woo Yutong Chi, Professor of Theology, you can correct me later, to introduce this evening's lecturer and respondent. Dr. Hastings.
Thank you, Brianna, for your work also in this series, both up front and behind the scenes. We do appreciate it. I want to add my warm welcome to this, the 5th and final installment in our Interface series. The ongoing purpose of these lectures has been to explore the many ways that theology and science can enrich one another because they are, in fact, co-inherent. That is, each is in the other, yet each is not the other. Now, this series has been for both scientists as well as for theologians. We think that the study of creation, or indeed the very definition of creation or matter or nature, is actually a multidisciplinary task that involves theology and science, philosophy and theology, biology and chemistry, and so on and so forth. And that therefore involves all of the faculties of a university. Regent College is an international graduate school of theology, and we're proud to be located here on the UBC campus, given its important contributions in all of these areas. Of course, the study and theorization of creation, along with their ethical implications, extend beyond the academy. Our series is therefore intended for a broader audience with an interest in these questions. And to those ends, this series is made possible by a very generous grant from the John Templeton Foundation, and we're very grateful to the Foundation for providing the means to bring you tonight's distinguished scholar. As this is the final lecture in the series, I wanted to pay special thanks to both Ashley Moyes, who was instrumental in setting the series up and has now taken a downward move to Oxford, and David Robinson, who is going to deliver the lecture tonight. Our 2 postdocs in this project have strategized and sequenced it with expertise. They've recruited speakers, and I'm really grateful for their work. Let me introduce David now. David is our Post-Doctoral Fellow in Science and Theology. He has his Ph.D. from the University of Edinburgh, following an MDiv here at Regent. This role that he's in as the Post-Doctoral Fellow in Theology and Science follows the completion of his Ph.D., and that research was focused on the intersection, partly on the intersection of evolutionary biology and theology, particularly the question of how natural causation is described vis-à-vis divine providence. His interests also include the philosophy of science and criticisms of natural theology in the 19th and 20th centuries. David is the author of Christ and Revelatory Community in Bonhoeffer's Reception of Hegel, which is just newly published. And the book includes material on Bonhoeffer's and Hegel's use of the Genesis account of creation and fall in their portrayals of emergent human consciousness. Selected chapters and other essays have been published in Modern Theology, Scottish Journal of Theology, Studies in Christian Ethics, and Journal of Society of Christian Ethics, and so on. Alongside his academic work, David has worked also as a pastor in the Anglican and Episcopal ministry since his ordination in 2009, serving congregations in both Ottawa and Edinburgh. This role has included teaching Christian ethics as an associate tutor with the Scottish Episcopal Institute. David lives here in Coquitlam with his wife Jolene, who works as marketing and communications manager for Jewish Family Services, and their 3-year-old daughter, Naomi. Tonight his topic is Beyond Design, Evolutionary Biology and a Theology of Preservation. And without further ado, I'm going to ask David to come and lecture for us. Let's welcome him. Actually, David, before you come, I do want to say that David's lecture will be responded to by Professor Lauren Wilkinson. He is the Professor Emeritus of Interdisciplinary Studies and Philosophy here at Regent. He has championed the cause of the study of science and theology here for a number of years as, I would describe Lauren, not to embarrass him, but as a polymath in the true sense of the term, being well-versed in both the arts as well as the sciences, theology and philosophy. He's written many scholarly and popular articles exploring the relationship of the human to the natural world in its environmental, aesthetic, scientific, and theological dimensions. He has edited the book Earthkeeping, Christian Stewardship of Natural Resources, and has a lead role in the documentary film Making Peace with Creation. He's also working on a book on the theology of creation, which I'm sure is imminent in its production. David, welcome tonight.
Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to have you for this finale. See that we're working. So, evolutionary biology and a theology of preservation. Introduction, a biologist's appeal. E.O. Wilson is well known for his important work in biology, particularly his study of ant colonies. While he now identifies as a scientific humanist, his vision of the natural world has been, quote, lastingly influenced by the lyrical and spiritual power of evangelical Christianity. In his book, The Creation, An Appeal to Save Life on Earth, he offers a moving set of letters to a pastor in his former denomination, the Southern Baptists. He frankly admits that they have irreconcilable disagreements about the origin of species, even as they both place a high value on the world we have. Surely, Wilson says, they could agree that even if humans don't see much of certain rare animals, the panda, the ivory-billed woodpecker, the giant squid, these serve to, quote, proclaim the mystery of the world. They are jewels in the crown of creation. Imagine the shock, he writes, of reading the following headline, Last Tiger Shot, Species Now Said Extinct. Such news would mean a diminished opportunity for scientific study, as well as narrowing a believer's impetus to praise. For as we know from the Bible's Psalms and wisdom literature, biodiversity is a liturgical matter. Unfortunately, biodiversity is rapidly losing ground. Extinctions have occurred with stunning frequency over Earth's natural history. There have been 5 mass extinctions and several minor extinction events. What Wilson is concerned with, however, is that since the Industrial Revolution, humans are becoming the primary drivers of species extinction. Much of this has to do with the fact that humans have become, in the words of archaeologist Bruce Smith, the ultimate ecosystem engineers. Our engineering has often led to habitat loss, the introduction of invasive species, pollution, and overharvesting. As a result, scientists have proposed that this new geological era should be titled the Anthropocene, to acknowledge the geophysical effects of human design. The image you're seeing now is one of several visual documentations of such effects by photographer Edward Bertinsky and his collaborators. Their Anthropocene project is currently on display at the National Gallery of Canada, and a film is showing across the country. Here then is Wilson's pointed question. Why don't we see the effects of our actions on other species, and indeed on the very future of Homo sapiens? Wilson speculates that our disregard is largely because of what he calls, quote, the philosophy of exemptionalism, which supposes that the special status on Earth of humanity lifts us above the laws of nature. Whether the reasons given are secular or religious, he writes that, quote, our species have become unresponsive to the forces that count most for its long-term survival. In part, this is because of our godlike technology. We see ourselves as exempt because we are a unique species, a species that can design our very life world. Now, as I put this picture back, I want to acknowledge what many of you are probably thinking. Wilson looks so much more authoritative with this large specimen at his side. I can only plead that you listen as carefully to the theologians, even though I couldn't find one whose picture included the object of her study. I'm deeply sympathetic to this biologist's appeal. As a contributor to our Interface series, though, I'm going to suggest that theology offers greater promise than the American powers of religion to which Wilson appeals. This is because good theology allows us to rethink the difference in origin accounts to which Wilson seems resigned. We'll hold Ross back for a moment. More to the point, if we're going to challenge human exemptionalism effectively, we're going to have to do better than Wilson's alternatives. He describes the positions as follows. This is from his book, Creation. The creation, whether you believe it was placed on this planet by a single act of God, or accept the scientific evidence that it evolved autonomously during billions of years, is the greatest heritage ever provided to humanity. The trouble with the first account is that a view of special creation often leads to humans seeing themselves as exempt from natural laws. If humanity's origins are not to be found in a process of natural causation, but a kind of flash into being, it makes sense that we would see ourselves as not beholden to nature for our long-term future. The trouble with the second account of sheer autonomy is that it is neither a full explanation of the evidence, nor will it suffice to challenge human exemptionalism. Therefore, this lecture will include a critical response to some of Wilson's controversial statements on the place of theology and indeed the basis of ethics. Well before he started to look for an alliance between science and religion, Wilson had predicted that theology would go extinct. In his book on human nature, he wrote that, quote, theology is not likely to survive as an independent intellectual discipline. By his account then, the phenomenon of religion could be explained in scientifically naturalist terms. Although he may have changed his mind here, and he's a great enough thinker that he does this, it remains an operative view among some scientists. In response, then, I want to make a strong claim to theology's independence. This is perhaps counterintuitively to claim a deeper engagement with science. For as Ross Hastings argues, we do not have to think that independence and deep relatedness are mutually exclusive. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture of him with a model of coherence, but you could see where that is going. In this first part, we're going to examine why design is usually seen as a foil to evolution. To use one example, geneticist Francis Crick writes that, quote, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. We're going to do so by giving the historical and conceptual background to appeals to an original design, which I'll render in the more historically specific word, contrivance. So part 1, questioning contrivance, natural theology meets evolutionary biology. And you'll see an outline of this part and the subsequent one on the handout that you'll have received on coming in. We will begin by briefly revisiting the classic modern form of English natural theology, that of William Paley from the early 19th century. Intricacies of the Watch. Paley's Natural Theology was published in 1802. The purpose of the book is made clear in its long subtitle, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity Collected from the Appearances of Nature. Now, Paley's book is an exercise in a certain type of natural theology that has been termed physico-theology. Physico-theology focuses on and argues from what appears to be designed in nature. A key term here is contrivance, which is to say that something has been custom built for a very specific purpose. The eye was contrived, much like the telescope, for the purpose of sight. A major implication here is that assembly could not happen gradually with a number of intermediate forms that had other purposes or no seeming purpose at all. But enough from me. Paley's book begins with the famous story about coming across two natural objects. In crossing a heath, his foot strikes a stone. It appears unremarkable to him, as though it had lain there forever. But when he comes upon a watch, he is utterly captivated. This lack of interest in the stone, though, is a critical omission, as we will see when we come to Darwin's own contrasting interest in geology. By focusing on the watch, Paley neglects the fact that rocks also tell time. Nevertheless, it is understandable that he chooses the mechanism. Paley is writing after Isaac Newton, when a certain mechanistic philosophy had become common. He also wrote in the wake of the new age of industrialization in England, which brought with it a popular interest in machinery. People were fascinated by what devices could do, and every new release evoked awe at human ingenuity. To catch something of this mood in our context, imagine seeing the first commercial for the Apple Watch Series 5. Here's a more antique, but still very exciting model. After a detailed study of the watch, we are led to a clear, indeed inevitable conclusion. Here are Paley's words in its citation number 1 on your handout. This mechanism being observed, the inference we think is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. As you can see, Paley is not speaking of the creator of Jewish and Christian belief directly. The one thing we know at this stage is that we have a purposeful piece of equipment, one which effectively keeps time, a time by which we can order our lives and societies. Order, I should add, was highly desirable at the dawn of the 19th century. Paley's claim to divine design expressed the era's widespread belief in providence, which was deeply shaped by its political context. England had, in the not too distant past, veered between Protestant and Catholic monarchs. It had lived through a civil war and a revolution. People were attracted to the picture of a harmonious system of nature, which abided by a series of regular laws and could underwrite social cohesion. Now, such a vision of natural order is easier to hold in a time when you could still believe that all original species still existed. This view was already being shaken by the discovery of the remains of giant mammoths and other fossils. While Paley acknowledges that fossils exist, he does not seem to let them challenge his picture of creation as relatively unchanging. In general, he does not seem to think it is possible for an entire species to be lost. Now, Paley's vision is compelling, but it has several theological weaknesses, of which I'll name 2. These are pointed out by our first interface lecturer, Alistair McGrath, in his excellent study, Darwinism and the Divine, Evolutionary Thought and Natural Theology. First, Paley's picture of design is so narrowly purposeful that there seems to be no space for chance. He actually defines chance as, quote, the operation of causes without design. Paley's exclusion of chance is not something that Christians have always believed. Thomas Aquinas, for example, draws on the book of Ecclesiastes to point out that time and chance happen to all, even as God is provident. Second, Paley does not develop a theory of intermediate causation in depth, although he does offer some suggestive analogies. By secondary or intermediate causes, we are speaking about those causes that carry out an effective purpose as distinct from the primary cause, God. Again, there are key places in classical theology that could have helped him here. Without such an account, his argument from design was vulnerable to challenge, particularly by Darwin's science some 50 years later. Before Darwin, though, several theologians offered critical alternatives to Paley. We can think of John Henry Newman and some of the authors in the Bridgewater treatises. As McGrath makes clear, there are multiple lines of criticism from within theology itself. In other words, not everything is at stake if physico-theology fails to convince on certain points. This is important because in an earlier interface lecture, we heard how early evangelicals responded to Newtonian science with a kind of physico-doxology. But as we move through the 19th century, the call to worship may have to change. Fortunately, evangelical expressions of wonder, love, and praise are not entirely beholden to any given scientific paradigm. As we have seen, Paley ignored the stone on the heath, and the new discovery of fossils did not do much to alter his natural theology. Charles Darwin, on the other hand, knew that the study of nature involved close attention to the stones. His work was deeply indebted in particular to geologist Charles Lyle. In Darwin's pithy statement, quote, "I always feel as if my books come half out of Lyle's brains." Lyle's Principles of Geology, first published in 1930-31, provided the longer time frame Darwin's evolutionary account needed. In particular, it gave him evidence of gradual extinctions in which parent species are replaced by slightly modified descendants. Along with Lyell's work, Darwin was an avid student of William Paley. Darwin read two of Paley's earlier works as a student at Cambridge. Though he likely read natural theology later, Darwin also referred warmly to that book. And there's a college legend that Darwin took up Paley's room after him. The influence is such that Paley and Darwin employ similar structures to their arguments, as pointed out by Stephen Jay Gould. Now, I would say here that Gould was a leading paleontologist with a command of his field, but with this picture, he really needs no introduction. Paley's and Darwin's similar argumentative structure can be seen in two ways. First, both authors argue from the artificial to the natural. Paley moves from human devices, such as the watch, to natural mechanisms, writing that, quote, "For every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature." Darwin begins with artificial selection, in this case, the selective breeding of animals by human beings. And for such a controversial book, I always find it remarkable that Origin of Species begins with a rather homey description of English pigeon breeding. However, Darwin points out that humans do not distinguish as finely as nature does. For example, they feed the same food to both a long and a short-beaked pigeon. Given breeders' lifespans and their varying commitments, artificial selection is relatively fickle and short-term. But because of Lyell's work, Darwin knows that nature has had a very, very long time to work on shaping and preserving the qualities that make a species well adapted to its environment. Second, in terms of the similar structure of argument, both authors actually use the same examples of complexity. Paley compares the eye and the telescope. Darwin states that the eye is the most complex natural design. He calls it an organ of extreme perfection, admitting that it's impossible to avoid comparing it to a telescope. But he then turns to question the presumption of comparing the Creator's works to human intellectual powers. Darwin can be understood as making a bold, indeed subversive argument against human projections onto God. He suggests this more astonishing process, and this is citation 2 in your handout. If we must compare the eye to an optical instrument, for example, a telescope, we ought in imagination to take a thick layer of transparent tissue with a nerve sensitive to light beneath, and then suppose every part of this layer to be continually changing slowly in density. He then details this process of selection. Go to the final line. Let this process go on for millions on millions of years, and during each year on millions of individuals of many kinds. And may we not believe that a living optical instrument might thus be formed as superior to one of glass as the works of the Creator are to those of humanity? Now, as here, Darwin, as Paley before him, and I think this is one of the things that attracted Darwin to his work, expressed wonder at the natural world. Indeed, this was probably something that Darwin appreciated in his predecessor. Darwin concludes The Origin of Species with his justly famous image of an entangled bank, inhabited by all manner of elaborately constructed forms, plants, birds, insects. He ends by marveling that from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. That said, Darwin is uniquely attentive to the struggle that underlies it all. Elsewhere in the entangled bank section, he mentions a struggle for life and the extinction of less improved forms. The higher animals only come, quote, from the war of nature, from famine and death. This is in stark contrast to Paley's focus on the harmony and bliss in nature. And here it's an important contextual factor that Paley served as an archdeacon in the Lake District of England, the place that inspired poets such as Wordsworth. Darwin, on the other hand, spoke hauntingly about how he struggles to believe that God would have designedly created certain species given their vicious modes of predation. But here we'll use the words of poet Robert Frost, whose poem Design watches a spider's deceptive method of catching prey. What but design of darkness to appall, if design govern in a thing so small? We should add here that one doesn't only have to observe the smallest creatures, witness the ingenuity of certain human methods for the industrial farming and slaughter of animals. In either case, Darwin's honest admission gives us one of the reasons why theology needs to move beyond design. Appeal to contrivance does not satisfyingly account for the wonder, as well as the violent struggle for existence, written in the stones and sounding from the tangled bank. Evolution is neither theistic nor anti-theistic, biologist Thomas Huxley observes. Huxley was Darwin's contemporary and opponent of much religious opposition to Darwin. Darwin was trying to firmly establish how natural causes operate, leaving open the question of whether and how God is active in the world. What is at stake between Paley and Darwin, then, is largely the issue of whether there are secondary or intermediate causes. Paley acknowledged them briefly, but they did not permeate his account. Can divine action and natural cause coincide? The claim that God called the earth to bring forth creatures of each kind, in the words of Genesis, can still hold. The question is not necessarily whether God created each according to its kind, but how God may have done this. And it's interesting, of course, that God calls the earth to bring forth the creatures. This is something that Augustine notices. In some ways, the Darwinian Revolution is more about a broader scientific and philosophical shift away from seeing species as fixed and immutable, custom-built before being set in their niche. Darwin was well aware of the paradigm shift his science was causing. It's part of why he took so long to publish. At one point, he observes that, quote, nature may be said to have taken pains to reveal by rudimentary organs and by homologous structures her scheme of modification, which it seems that we willfully will not understand. So why would his contemporaries, and indeed many today, willfully not understand? As Darwin wryly observes, quote, anyone whose disposition leads him to attach more weight to unexplained difficulties than to the explanation of a certain number of facts will certainly reject my theory. Unexplained difficulties or gaps in natural history. What we're calling gaps can occur in many areas. Let's use the gaps in the sequence of body plans between fish and tetrapod. that which has 4 feet or limbs. You can see that we begin with fins at the bottom of this slide, then we see the gradual emergence of limbs moving up to the top right. At first, these are non-functional, so the creature could not walk. They're rudimentary. But eventually you come across a body plan that can seem to shuffle or crawl on the earth. Taken together, they suggest that certain crawling things that crawl upon the earth, to use the language of Genesis, emerged from the water. But because we cannot go back to the exact moment in evolutionary history, someone could respond that this gap is evidence of divine intervention and special creation, the placement of a particular species in that site. More controversially, of course, a gap can be seen to exist between the genus Australopithecus and the genus Homo. In this case, the sense of uniqueness we feel as Homo sapiens appears to be at stake, so we want that gap in particular to remain in place. My point with these brief illustrations is that it remains tempting for those who believe in a creator to look for God in the shadows of nature's causal pathway. However, the burden of proof is not merely on those, such as Darwin, who give an account of descent with modification. Darwin himself makes this point. This is citation 3. But do they, those who believe in special creation, really believe that at innumerable periods in the Earth's history, certain elemental atoms have been commanded suddenly to flash into living tissues? Do they believe that at each supposed act of creation, one individual or many were produced? Were all the infinitely numerous kinds of animals and plants created as eggs or seed or as full grown? And in the case of mammals, were they created bearing the false marks of nourishment from their mother's womb? Although naturalists very properly demand a full explanation of every difficulty from those who believe in the mutability of species, that is Darwin's theory, on their own side they ignore the whole subject of the first appearance of species in what they consider reverent silence. These questions are critical for those who appeal to the watches in creation as though they had flashed into existence. A recent proponent of the contrivance argument is biochemist Michael Behe, and his focus on the bacterial flagellum, which he likens to an outboard motor. It is astonishing how much weight is placed on that tiny whip, which, seen as it is irreducibly complex, could have no prior forms with purpose or lack of purpose of their own. Now, it is appropriate to focus on the molecular level and to study it with reverence, but it is dangerous to try to silence scientific inquiry behind that. A major risk, of course, in identifying God's action with unexplained difficulties is that the cumulative discoveries of science can gradually close up those gaps. As a result, God seems to be gradually pushed out of the process. But even if a gap could be maintained, we have to ask what has happened that our view of God's action could be threatened by scientific discovery. This is a concern voiced by theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his reflection on the work of a then contemporary physicist. He writes, this is citation 4, "This study has again brought home to me quite clearly that we shouldn't think of God as the stopgap for the incompleteness of our knowledge, because then, as is objectively inevitable, when the boundaries of knowledge are pushed ever further, God too is pushed further away and thus is ever on the retreat. We should find God in what we know, not in what we don't know. God wants to be grasped by us not in unsolved questions, but in those that have been solved. This is true of the relation between God and scientific knowledge." Years later, the chemist Charles Coulson puts a fine point on it. Quote, "When we come to the scientifically unknown, our correct policy is not to rejoice because we have found God, it is to become better scientists." Following their leads, I suggest that a healthy interface between theology and the biological sciences requires a broader willingness to give up the gaps. To stall because every single step in a natural pathway cannot be seen would be to miss the immense amount of evidence that Darwin's theory has explained then, which has only grown in the 150 years since it is published. This also means that those who do not believe in a creator need not shadow box with a form of the design argument from the 19th century. For some, it will be uncontroversial to point out the problem with the God of the gaps approach. However, there is another way that I think gap thinking can hinder theology. only this time it is the assumption of a gapless natural economy in which creatures make themselves that seems to place God on the retreat. I'm going to argue that in the attempt to give up the gaps in the record of natural causation as sites of God's design, certain theologians can give us another type of competition between causes. This occurs under some depictions of creation as an act of kenosis. In brief, kenosis is a reference to the claim of Philippians 2 that Jesus Christ, quote, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the very form of a servant. The verb for emptied himself is kanao. So kenosis is a reference to Christ's self-emptying. And the more typical reading in church history, and one that informs much kenotic theology, is that Jesus self-emptied of his divine powers. Since Darwin, kenosis has been particularly appealing as a way to articulate how God, the creator, relates to creation. And there are some important contributions that this makes. In particular, it's Christologically oriented, and it offers a serious response to the pain and suffering in long tracts of evolutionary history. However, it seems to me that there's a cost to this, one that's paid because proponents are seeking to oppose an interventionist account of divine power. In the words of Catholic theologian John Hott, quote, God's unobtrusive and self-absenting mode of being invites the world to swell forth continually. Elsewhere he writes, it is a humble retreat on God's part that allows the cosmos to stand forth on its own and then to evolve as a relatively autonomous reality distinct from its creative ground. He continues that creation is an instance of self-giving love and letting be. Although physicist John Polkinghorne is more careful, a similar approach can be seen when he speaks of a, quote, world in which divine power is deliberately self-limited to allow causal space for creatures. The risk I'd like to highlight with this line of thought is that it mirrors too closely that which it opposes. In the desire to resist an interventionist picture of God, it speaks of a non-intervening God. Creaturely freedom is then said to require God's withdrawal so as not to causally compete, rather than requiring God's power precisely to sustain the creature in its causal freedom. In this way, although Hott begins his book, God After Darwin, with a chapter entitled Beyond Design, and I promise I picked my title before I found this, it seems that his account is still in thrall to the design arguments he seeks to oppose. In his case, the kenosis of the Creator represents a narrowing of scope. It seems a retreat from the fullness of the God who upholds all things by the word of his power, in the words of Hebrews 1. As Sarah Coakley writes in her criticism of kenotic theologies, quote, it is vital to avoid the presumption that God competes with the evolutionary process as a very big bit player in the temporal unfolding of natural selection. Coakley is alert to the fact that competition is assumed in accounts of contriving intervention, design arguments, as well as those that speak of withdrawing non-intervention, which she refers to as God feebly failing to intervene. She continues, rather, God is that without which there would be no evolution at all. God is the one who created out of nothing and preserves creation against the nothingness that encroaches. For God to withdraw or to self-absent would mean that nothingness has its way. The better move, I think, with kenosis doctrine is to move from Christology to our ethics. Let this same mind be in you, Philippians states, an imperative that Christopher Southgate, among others, develops in a promising direction. But with that brief provocation, we turn to our theology and ethics of preservation. Part 2 is titled, After Exceptionalism, Toward a Theological Ethics of Preservation. Now, since Darwin, many theologians have sought to insist on human uniqueness. There are good evolutionary reasons for such insistence, as UBC's Edward Slingerland has shown from his work in the cognitive sciences. In his words, quote, we are evolved in such a way as to be incapable, at some level, of believing in evolution. This becomes especially problematic, though, when it leads us to exceptionalism. that humans are the exception to the forces that sustain or cut short the life of other species. But why should the dominant species care about more vulnerable ones? Wasn't Darwin's subtitle "The Preservation of Favored Races" in the struggle for life? The effects of the Industrial Revolution that so shaped Paley's thought are now understood to be more problematic than ever. In the current age, the Geological Epoch, with the Anthropocene as its proposed name, we are learning that human expressions of design and the artificial are not so innocent. Rather than humbly serving as analogies for natural processes or indeed divine action, they often turn out to be inimical to the natural. Now, we have spoken about the importance of context as our technology, politics, and economics condition our theology, and vice versa. Today, we remain fascinated by human designs, while at the same time we become increasingly concerned about their cumulative effects. Such concern was memorably expressed in the year 2000 when atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen declared, "We are in the Anthropocene. In light of humanity's massive impact on the planet, this could no longer be called the Holocene." Crutzen had tied this turn of the ages to the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century and how the combustion of fossil fuels changed Earth's atmosphere. However, from the point of view of the geological sciences, some argue that we should consider how this change can be read in the rocks. Again, the importance of not ignoring the rocks. In this case, the spread of radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons testing, beginning in 1945, is an unambiguous marker. That mark in Earth's strata coincides with an overall uptick in the human effects on Earth, such that the mid-20th century has been labeled a great acceleration. Here I'm going to give you a brief look at charts from the work of Stephan et al., entitled Global Change in the Earth System. The reason for showing these all at once, you may not be able to read them all, is that you can see the steep incline around 1950. That year is marked by a dotted vertical line near the increase in the graph. The horizontal axis as a whole spans from 1750 to 2010 for your reference. We'll just pick a couple of these graphs. In the chart on your top left corner, you can see that the global population has increased from 2 to 7 billion within the past 60 years. Consumption also takes a sharp spike. As we're an academic institution, and because I am a former tree planter from northern BC, I'll highlight that paper production has gone from below 100 up to 400 million tons since 1950. Many of these Earth system charts, and you can see how they mirror each other, deal in losses. In the bottom left corner, marine fish capture goes from around 10 to 70 million tons in the Great Acceleration. Tropical forest loss goes from, in 1750, near 0% to nearly 30% in 2010. In the bottom left corner, there is also notice of how a now roughly 30% decrease in mean species abundance. But that question of extinction raises, the question that extinction raises is best shown in the following graph. This is taken from a 2015 work of Ceballos et al. Titled Accelerated Modern Human-Induced Species Losses. The horizontal axis shows the time interval spanning from the 16th to the 20th century, 21st century. Running along that axis, you'll see a dotted line, which is the historical baseline for extinctions. So they've taken a kind of natural rate of extinctions from the fossil records before human impact was so great. And they've set this rather high, 2 species extinctions per million species per year. But you can see that the background line there, right near the horizontal axis, remains quite low in comparison with what's happened since the mid-19th century, when you get a spike so that we've climbed from under 0.5% to 2% of species in the case of mammals. This shows that, quote, the average rate of vertebrate species loss over the last century is up to 100 times higher than the background rate, unquote, leading the authors to claim that we are heading to a 6th mass extinction but again, this one being largely a result of human effects. So with this acceleration and extinction, the threat of non-existence, where do we begin our ethical response? Again, what is the basis for a dominant species being concerned about the loss of another, more vulnerable species? For all his close attention to the book of nature, there remains something artificial in Darwin. It is not clear to me that he got beyond design. Darwin's picture of natural selection was in a sense very Victorian. It seemed to align with a Whiggish view of historical progress. As Darwin states, and as natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, all corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress toward perfection. How, though, is such perfection attained? Remember that Darwin, like Paley, argued from the artificial to the natural. In Darwin's case, he began with artificial breeding. The reference to domestic breeding turns up again when he speaks about human reproduction. Because of the social welfare systems of certain countries, including Britain, quote, "the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the human race." That's from Descent of Man. What's more, Darwin worked with an explicit racial hierarchy, assuming that the gap between the so-called civilized and savage peoples would grow wider, with intermediary forms going extinct. Mercifully, science can self-correct. The science of the genome combined with evolutionary theory have debunked this kind of racializing hierarchy. Still, it remains important to confront this aspect of his thought, for gene science has given us new and subtler possibilities for eugenics, which is to say, the science of good genes. Further darkening the picture of social Darwinism, though, at the time, political philosopher Herbert Spencer coined the term survival of the fittest, which he allied to an economic program that left the most vulnerable of society to fend for themselves. This is the kind of social Darwinism that North American social gospelers, for example, sought to oppose. In his critical response to that particular picture of social Darwinism, primatologist Frans de Waal has argued that of course biological science can be read selectively. It's like the Bible in that it can be used to devise terrible social ethics. But de Waal argues that we have to see the other Darwin. That is how Darwin's work leads us to see the evolution of empathy or cooperation. And de Waal is very intentionally writing after the financial crash, in which selfish motives played such a major part, and seeks to have us learn what nature's lessons for a kinder society, as the book's subtitle goes. De Waal does this by tracing instances of empathy and group concern in primates. And as you'll recall from our interface lecture by Sarah Coakley, we are also seeing more clearly how natural selection does not just reward genetic selfishness, so to speak. It can favor those who cooperate or even make sacrifice. As Darwin also writes in The Descent of Man, quote, "There can be no doubt that a tribe including many members who are always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over other tribes, and this would be natural selection." His clairvoyance on this front has been supported by recent findings in mathematical biology, in part thanks to the finding of UBC scientists such as Michael DeBelli and Christoph Hauert. However, here too there is an important caution. Coakley warns that we not read the evolution of cooperation as, in all cases, morally praiseworthy. Cooperation is a form of one's fitness loss for another's benefit, and it can lead to either good or evil. Dictatorial regimes are often models of cooperation. Now, it is not my purpose to adjudicate between so-called social Darwinism and de Waal's other Darwinism. My point for now is that nature is often ambivalent. It can be read either way. Nature, however, is not the only book we're given to read. Theology is, Pache Wilson, an independent discipline. One of the main criticisms of natural theology by theologians such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth is that claims about God were being drawn in too closely to claims about nature and culture. Their response was an exercise in theological freedom. Such freedom, I would argue, is necessary in thinking about ethics vis-à-vis nature and indeed theology in relation to science. Karl Barth lands this point in a critical exchange with his former teacher, Adolf von Harnack. Harnack had asked the following question: is there really any other theology than that which has a firm connection and blood relationship to science? Barth's reply sets the stage for the approach I am taking here. Citation 5 on your handout. If theology regained the courage to be objective, the courage to become a witness to the word of revelation, then it could also be that science in general would have to look out for its firm connection and blood relationship to theology, rather than the other way around. For it would perhaps also be better for the physicians and philosophers if they knew what the theologians should know. What theologians should know, he notes, admitting that often theologies, perhaps natural theology in particular, give up their own best resources as they try to be relevant to a given scientific consensus. Let's turn then to an exercise in such theology on the theme of God's preserving, towards a more robust interface with biology. Within his larger doctrines of creation and providence, Karl Barth begins his treatment of how God relates to creatures with a discussion of God's preserving work. I'm going to highlight 3 features of his discussion. 1, God gives the creature its being within time. Quote, in the same way that he willed and gave it to the creature to become and to be, so he wills and gives it to the creature to be again and again, to continue to be. In short, God, quote, keeps faith with the creature over its lifespan. In this way, even the smallest creature plays its role in the covenant of grace that is the internal basis of the creation. This is one of the ways that Barth makes clear that the God who preserves the creature is not a mere supreme being, but the God of the biblical revelation. Indeed, Barth goes on to speak of how God accompanies the creature, continually repeating that this is not some mechanical operation. The term is concursus, and watch for Ross Hastings' future work on this theme. 2, the creature is preserved as a free act of God, and yet, quote, the creation itself is the means by which it is preserved in being, unquote. Here, in his theology of preservation, Barth speaks of intermediary causes. How are creatures preserved? Quote, the human race as a whole and all the species of beasts and plants by natural propagation, the individual by his human and cosmic environment, and every creaturely thing by its environment, and according to the particular order of that environment, unquote. These means are the proper arena for scientific inquiry, the adaptation of a creature to its ecological niche, and its arrangement of that niche to serve its needs, the variations that take place under the work of natural selection. But these are all at the same time the free act of God and an expression of divine power to preserve the creature in its temporal existence. Because, 3, God meets the needs of the creature as it stands under the threat of nothingness. Here Barth invokes the doctrine of creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. The creature was not from all eternity like God. There was a time when it was not. Here he refers to Genesis 1 and the forming of habitable spaces which the creature is given to occupy. There is the primal division, of course, between the formless and void and God's let there be. There are then a series of divisions depicted in the first 3 days, such as that between the land and the sea, that provide habitable zones, spaces of preservation. The subsequent 3 days are then the filling of those zones by creaturely life. But that is not to say that the chaos, the nothingness, is no more. Barth points to accounts of flood and plague to show that the non-being continues to threaten. Quote, creation is in itself and as such is menaced by it, menaced by the chaos which to some extent borders it, couching at the door, unquote. Theologian Neil Messer has used Barth's account of the nothingness, das Nichtige, as an account for what we will call natural evil. A fuller answer to evil, though, requires that we remember the culmination of such divine preservation. Barth says this in citation 6, quote, "God's merciful will was to take up the cause of the creature against the non-existent, not from the safe height of a supreme world, but in the closest possible proximity, with the greatest possible directness, that is, himself to become a creature." This turn to Christology, which we can't develop at too much length here, has significant ethical implications, as we will see in a moment. Before that, though, we should ask a pointed question. What form is taken today by the nothingness that threatens creation? And have human beings become complicit with it? Has our ecosystem engineering meant that God's primal divisions have been crossed to the detriment of creaturely life? Ethics for the new natural. Dietrich Bonhoeffer became increasingly aware of the problem of drawing theological conclusions from nature and culture. The Germany of the 1920s and 30s was hard-pressed economically following a costly war and its sanctions. A narrative about nature as a site of vicious struggle for limited resources had an immediate, intuitive appeal. In a 1932 lecture, he identifies the danger in reading our social ethics off the surface of nature, what people in his time were doing by talking about orders of creation. The original design in that case was social. It was to say that God wove into the original creation certain patterns of relating. The problem here, he recognized, is that all kinds of things were being justified on the basis of nature/creation. Quote, "The strife among the peoples of humanity, national struggle, war, class distinctions, the exploitation of the weak by the strong." Disturbingly, theologians who appealed to orders of creation appealed to the biological bonds of people, folk, and race, which were said to be rooted in the original natural order, with portentous political effects. There are several problems with this. One is that they are relatively static orders, and so in some sense not properly Darwinian enough. But the one I want to focus on is that they appeal to nature creation without accounting for the fall. But as Bonhoeffer and other theologians who were critical of this movement maintained, the human mind and thus our claims to what is natural have become riven by the knowledge of good and evil. Bonhoeffer's early critical approach to this was to say that we can no longer speak of creation orders as though nature gave us an ethic directly. He spoke instead of orders of preservation, claiming that God has given certain social orders to preserve life. Citation 7 on your handout. And I do think it's remarkable that they're both reaching for the language of preservation at different times, of course, but in the midst of this polemic. Citation 7, "In the historic change of the orders of the world, the church must keep its eyes on this alone, which orders are most likely to stop this radical decline of the world in death and sin, and will thereby be in a position to hold open the way for the gospel." Bonhoeffer made plain that the orders of preservation get their bearings not from some original state of creation which is now distorted to our view. Rather, their basis is God's revelation in Christ, and on this basis alone, social orders can be broken or made anew. In the early 1930s, addressing a global ecumenical organization, Bonhoeffer's specific appeal was for a new order to stem nationalist resentment and war over resources. In short, he advocated a new order for international peace. Now, Bonhoeffer came to shift away from the language of orders in his later writings, actually attempting to reclaim the category of the natural for Protestants. But the appeal for preservation remains in those late writings. On the one hand, the natural, as he describes it, contains, quote, "a moment of independence, of self-development that is indeed appropriate to the natural." At the same time, and these two things do not compete, the natural was that which was oriented toward Christ and the new creation. It could not be sheer autonomy because if it came to act to destroy creaturely life, it would be acting as the unnatural. So what would such an appeal look like today? In 2018, the sciences have shown us how precarious life is. For the first time in Earth's history, we are faced with a mass extinction accelerated by the actions of one species. To adapt Bonhoeffer's thinking, New orders of preservation are yet to be discovered and adopted. Social forms as the means through which God is preserving the earth. Well, we have to acknowledge that many faith communities still don't know how to do this. And at times, it's the best place to begin by admitting our incompetence, as ethicist Willis Jenkins has acknowledged, in order to see a new future. Even so, there are groups like Arusha that work across national borders and species distinctions to cooperate with God's preserving work. I'll also mention the way that Lauren Wilkinson has shown that an ethics of preservation begins in our own backyards. And here I want to give an enthusiastic endorsement to his and Ewan Russell Jones's recent documentary, Making Peace with Creation. These are promising expressions of what it means to do theology and science after exceptionalism, which is to say, with the acknowledgement that human beings, for all their powers of design, are first and foremost creatures made in the image of a preserving God. Conclusion, an interface for life. In this lecture, I have argued that a healthy interface between theology and the biological sciences requires moving beyond design in two respects. First, there has to be a more thorough move to give up the gaps, to acknowledge that all divine and creaturely causation need not compete on the same plane. As I have shown, this is not to dismiss God's activity as creator of all life. It rather witnesses to the fullness of God's creative action. Second, I have argued that the challenge to design thinking has to go further in this age we call the Anthropocene. For as we are learning, human designs are not innocent. Rather than being an easy analogy for God's action in nature, they are all too often inimical to nature. I have therefore pressed the criticism of natural theology by beginning from the word that the Creator God continually preserves even the smallest creature from non-existence over the allotted course of its life. By way of creaturely response, new social orders are invited to slow the great acceleration, particularly insofar as human expansion can mean the extinction of other whole species. All that said, I want to conclude on a note of promise for both science and theology. That is, the continued discovery of species. Though estimates vary widely, one recent estimate suggests that over 80% of species remain unnamed. As E.O. Wilson writes, quote, each species merits careers of scientific study and celebration by historians and poets. That, Pastor, is the compelling moral argument from science for saving the creation. We will want to add the celebration of theologians, of course, for we know that a full encyclopedia of life would expand our account of the God who creates, then freely and graciously preserves us creatures in being. Thank you.
As we transition now into a response by Dr. Wilkinson, I would just like to give you a quick word about question period. Should you desire to ask a question of Dr. Robinson following the response, I'll invite you to head to the microphones at the back of the room. There's one on either side. Please embrace the microphones, get quite close like an ice cream, and speak clearly into them. And if I could kindly remind you too to please make your questions concise and limit them to one question. Thank you. Dr. Wilkinson.
No. Thank you, and thank you, Peter, for this lecture. And thanks for the privilege of having a small part in this brilliant interface series, which I've wanted to come to but haven't been able to. I've been away. It's so hard to respond to this briefly. I'm going to do my best. But, responses like this, they're basically, what I wanted to say is yes, yes, yes. Or in some cases, yes, and in one or two cases, yes, but. So I'll do a bit of all of that. It's also been frustrating for me because yesterday morning, I was in Malaysia and just returned from 2 weeks there, living and writing at a house of a former student who runs a kind of retreat place. They built this wonderful place in the jungle, beside a jungle river. He's Malaysian, but he got his doctorate in zoology, master's in zoology. About the time he became a Christian, his 2 kids are in science. One works as a researcher for the Museum of Natural History in Singapore. The other is doing research on the rapid decline of flying foxes, the largest bat in the world. And she would take me out and show me all these critters, all these things. And every so often, things like a flock of, whatever you call a group of gibbons, would come brachiating through the trees. And it's an astonishing place to be, also in a country which is fighting rapid species extinction. Tigers are very much on the decline. There are only 2 rhinos left alive in Malaysia. But that's the context, one of the contexts in which I'm speaking to you, a little bit jet-lagged. I want to make four points in response. First, I just want to thank you, Peter, for helping to correct a tragic mistake that has resulted from Christian discomfort from evolution. I call it not the theory of evolution, but the fact of evolution. And you make that correction in your opening remarks. I really appreciate this way of putting it, that we've been far more concerned about origins than extinctions, which is a tragedy. As you say, we're entering the 6th great period of extinction on the planet. But this one is caused not by massive volcanic eruptions or meteor strikes, but the actions of we human beings, who we believe are called to be God's image bearers and given the vocation of representing the very nature of God to creation. And creation is a far better name for what it is that science studies, for the world, than is nature or the environment. Yet we've twisted the word creation away from being a name for this gracious miracle that we live in. Evangelical Christianity has narrowed the word, the meaning of the word, to an argument about how God did it and when God did it. Our colleague Jonathan Wilson, you out there, Jonathan, somewhere, has written a book recently called God's Good World, lamenting the way in which the doctrine of creation has largely dropped out of evangelical thinking. He calls for the recovery of the fuller meaning of creation, and your paper, including this whole interface series, it seems to me, is a step towards that recovery. So I want to thank you for recalling us to a much richer understanding of creation than just to talk about origins, and to look at it in the context of this tragedy of extinction is very important. Second, I want to say a bit about this problem of human exemptionalism, a term that you borrow from E.O. Wilson. And I certainly agree very much with the danger of that idea, that somehow we can ignore the laws that govern all life on Earth because of our godlike technology, which is Wilson's phrase. The idea that can somehow lift us above those laws. I want to make 2 points here, and then a bit of a comment on Wilson himself. First, avoiding the danger of exemptionalism, that we can somehow be lifted out of nature's laws, is not the same thing as to say that humans are just the same as all other creatures. There is something different about us. And you weren't saying otherwise, of course. But I want to underline the fact that I want to say exemptionalism, no, but exceptionalism, yes. There is something special about human beings. Recognizing that we're a part of what Wilson calls nature, produced by the same evolutionary process that produced other life. We need to recognize that we're supported by that life, is not the same as to say that we are not different. Theologically, we must acknowledge no other animal is called to be in the image of God. When I watched, as I did several times in this last couple of weeks, long-tailed macaques and short-tailed macaques and brachiating gibbons, all monkeys, apes, primates, fellow primates, cousin primates, I guess we could say, we have to be pretty blind to see that they're not related. We're not deeply related to them, but also that we are profoundly different. This keeps coming back to me when I think I had the privilege of attending the Earth Summit in Rio in '92. The biggest insight that came to me from that meeting was recognizing one day when I was sitting in this big kind of conference center where it was working, kind of open to the air, and there was a bird had gotten in by accident, was trying to get out. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, this is the Earth Summit, but nobody else is here except people, except that one bird. We were the only ones who came. And that, I think, seems to me underlines the fact of the exceptional nature of human nature. We have indeed, the idea of exemptionalism has done great damage, but it's also been accompanied by our human ability to feel the pain of that damage and to try to address it. Now, here I have to say a little bit about Wilson. He's famous for many things. I think he's perhaps the greatest living biologist. I have tremendous respect for his work. He's famous not just for studying ants. His work on ants won a Pulitzer Prize. I think he's the only living person who's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for his work on ants and the other for his work on human nature. He didn't just study ants. He gave scientific precision, almost created the concept of biodiversity through his work on island ecosystems. And he's become recently one of the most passionate scientific voices for the stewardship of creation. He uses both those terms, stewardship and creation, in that book-length open letter to a Baptist pastor that you quoted from. At the same time, Wilson is a pioneer in what was once called sociobiology. His book, Sociobiology, The New Synthesis, describes that. What's more commonly called evolutionary psychology today, the idea that our behavior, even our ethics, is determined by our evolutionary path, understood simply as a matter of random natural selection. And I think Sarah Coakley's work is questioning some of this idea fairly profoundly, but he was kind of the pioneer of it. He begins that second Pulitzer Prize-winning book on human nature by pointing out that not only are we not as free as we think we are because of our evolutionarily determined makeup, but also that if, as he believes, or said he believed at that point, chance and environmental necessity, not God, made the species, then we don't have any place to go as a species. We just kind of landed here as one of the random things that's happening in a random universe. But it seems to me there's a profound contradiction between, on the one hand, the ethical passion for the care of creation that Wilson demonstrates so well, as he points out the danger of exemptionalism, for example, that we're different, that we don't have to follow those rules, and his whole passion for environmental stewardship. There's a profound contradiction between that and the belief that we are simply the result of a cosmic accident. And this paradox is shared by many in the environmental movement today. If we're just a part of what is happening randomly in nature, and those J-shaped curves that we saw so depressing many of in your graphs, are a picture of, it could be a picture of what happens to algae on a Petri dish as it begins to expand geometrically and approaches the limit of its food supply. But if that's what nature is doing, why worry about it? It's just what nature does. And yet we do worry about it. Now, back to Wilson for a minute. Several years ago, I was asked to give a talk in London to a joint meeting of the Linnaean Society and the British Ecological Society on the topic, the meaning of value in biodiversity. It's a great privilege. I ended it by, it was a big portrait of Darwin, which was where he glaring down at us because the Linnaean Society was where Darwin and Wallace first presented their work in 1859. I ended that paper by talking a bit about this contradiction between ethical passion on the one hand and a commitment to a completely evolutionary view on the other. using Wilson as a prominent example, and I called that part of the paper The Tragedy v.O. Wilson. And a few years later, I was at a meeting of scientists and evangelicals, some were both scientists and evangelicals, which Wilson helped organize. It was co-sponsored by the National Association of Evangelicals in the United States and the Harvard Medical School, about the time he published that book, The Creation. And I was fortunate enough to have a pretty leisurely conversation with Wilson over a glass of wine, listening to a gospel quartet in a southern mansion where the conference was held. And Wilson, who was a very kind and gentlemanly man, said how right it felt for him to be back at the end of his career in the South, listening to gospel music. And I got up my nerve and asked if he would read what I had written about the tragedy of E.O. Wilson. He agreed, and a few days later, he sent me a response. And he said he agreed pretty much with everything I said, but he'd call it not a tragedy, but a paradox. Well, it is a deep paradox indeed. The ethical concerns for the care of creation, or nature, or the environment, or whatever we want to call it, and more generally, the passion for knowing more about creation, which lies at the heart of true science, are inconsistent with the idea that we're simply one more part of nature understood as a purposeless process. And in Wilson's case, of course, the tragedy is deepened because as a boy, he says he was a committed Christian, having, in his words, read the Bible through 2 or 3 times and accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. It's a direct quote. Been baptized. But then he discovered that there was no room in his theology for evolution, which he had realized was a key which made sense of his love of nature. Let me read you the opening of Wilson's fascinating autobiography, The Naturalist. I stand in the shallows, staring down at a huge jellyfish in water so still and clear that its every detail is revealed as though it were trapped in glass. The creature is astonishing. It existed outside my previous imagination. Why do I tell you this little boy's story, Wilson writes? Because it illustrates how a naturalist, one could say a scientist, is created. A child comes to the edge of deep water with a mind prepared for wonder. His words underline the fact that at the heart of every scientist's experience, whatever their religion or lack of it, is the irreducibility of 2 miracles, or singularities, if you prefer the more scientific word. The miracle of the cosmos, which is astonishingly improbable in its friendliness for life, and the miracle of our awareness of it. And that wonder, it seems to me, is a source of 3 uniquely human things: worship and theology, I suppose, is part of that, science and art. These are all, it seems to me, reasons to speak of the uniqueness, the exceptionalism of we humans. Third, very briefly, let me just affirm all that Peter says about the necessity and the good of being delivered from a theology of finding God in the gaps. He quotes from the Cambridge scientist C.A. Coulson, a Christian: where we find a gap in our knowledge, we don't rejoice that we find God, we resolve to do better science. I like to pair that quote with words from a Christian contemporary of Darwin, Aubrey Moore, who said, welcomed evolution because he was one of many Christian defenders of Darwin back then, welcomed evolution because it brought God back into the process of creation, not just in the past, but now. And Moore said the problem with the theology of occasional divine intervention is that it has as its corollary the assumption of ordinary divine absence. But God, as you have so well said in your quotes from Barth and Bonhoeffer, is nowhere absent from creation. The Creator sustains it at every point by what Irenaeus calls God's 2 hands, word and spirit. We can think of Psalm 104, you send forth your spirit, they are created. We think of the abundant New Testament texts which link Christ and creation. And you draw eloquently on Barth and Bonhoeffer to argue for God's sustaining of all creation at every moment. Thus, there's no gap where God is not. Which brings me to my final point, which is the only kind of yes, but, I want to say, and perhaps the closest to a disagreement, and that has to do with what seems to me your too ready dismissal of the relevance of the idea of kenosis. You're probably not surprised at this. For our understanding of God's relationship to creation. And I agree that this argument against the relevance of kenosis is valid if by that we mean that there's either God's action or the creature's action. God has to withdraw in order to let there be room for creaturely causation. But that disjunction implies a natural, supernatural distinction. But in fact, there is, I reject that natural, supernatural distinction because, as I tried to say in referring to creation and to the cosmos as a miracle, there is no natural. Whether or not we recognize it or not, no matter how much we explain something naturally, it's still miraculous, coming in the end up against two singularities, the fact of the cosmos and the fact of consciousness. Why is there something and not nothing, and why and how are we conscious of it? I go back to that image of the young Wilson looking at in wonder at the miracle of the jellyfish. As some of you know, I've spent a very long time an absurdly long time, trying to write a book tentatively called Circles and the Cross, trying to work out the implicit symbolism of the Celtic cross. If we understand the circle of that ancient image as representing both creation and our consciousness of it, what does it mean that it is centered on the cross, which is the clearest picture we have of God's self-giving love? What that image says, it seems to me, is consistent with Scripture, which speaks of Christ, the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world, as the one in whom all things hold together, without whom nothing was made that has been made. So God is never absent from the gift and miracle of creation. Kenosis in creation, it seems to me, does not mean that absence of God or withdrawal from God, a gap which makes room for the creature. God is already present, and I appreciate very much the material from Barth and Bonhoeffer that talk about so eloquently about that sustaining of God. At the same time, creation is a gift, a costly gift, and it is other than God. God sustains it, but sustains it in its otherness, an otherness which God sees. The verb is important, I think. It sees and not says. God sees its otherness, sees that it's good, and ultimately, and it seems to me the whole biblical story is about this, takes upon himself the consequence of that, of creating and sustaining that otherness. God does indeed sustain all creatures by his word of power, as you quote from Hebrews 1, but at the same time, he holds back his power in letting those things be themselves in all their diversity. Creation is a costly gift, and we see that gift most clearly in the cross at the heart of creation. The poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, in one of his journals, put this very eloquently, if a little cryptically. Suppose God showed us in a vision the whole world enclosed first in a drop of water, allowing everything to be seen in its native colors, then the same in a drop of Christ's blood, by which everything was turned to scarlet, keeping nevertheless mounted in the scarlet its own color too. That gets, it seems to me, at the mystery of kenosis in creation. It is that diversity, those diverse colors and creatures of the world, that's being diminished in the extinctions of the Anthropocene, which you've illustrated with painful detail. You conclude by affirming the work of all those who are trying to name and sustain and care for that diversity. You mentioned the ongoing desire to identify the Earth's living diversity and honor organizations like Arasha. That Philippians 2 passage, which speaks of God's emptying himself in Christ, is prefaced in that text, which you quoted, by this very challenging call to have this mind in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. When we use our powers, our technologies, our scientific skills, Wilson is right, I think, in calling them godlike. Not to increase our glory, but to offer creation back to the Creator through our worship, our art, and our science. We are, I think, being an image of God in the temple of creation. I'm grateful to you, Peter, for helping us understand that high calling better. So thanks.